exactly how Escoffier intended it to be more than 100 years ago. Today we're making Beef Bourguignon, a French bistro classic with a history dating back to 1867. One of the fathers of modern French cooking, Escoffier, included this iconic dish in his 1903 cookbook, Le Guide de Culinaire. Today we're going to take the journey together, following Escoffier's recipe to recreate the dish. This is piece of beef à la Bourguignon, and we start by making Escoffier's brown stock, the fond brun. Here we have some beef bones, which would contribute to the deep and robust flavors, strong savory notes to form the backbone, no pun intended, of our stock. And we have some veal bones, which is extremely high in collagen. Through cooking, it'll break down and form gelatin, giving us texture and body. Veal in general is also extremely prized in sauce making because of its neutral taste. Now, to put the brown in brown stock, this goes into a preheated oven at 200 degrees Celsius, first for 45 minutes. After 45 minutes, we have the Maillard reaction, the amino acid and the reducing sugar from the meat reacting with each other, making everything taste meaty. We have caramelization, adding depth. Now, we add the mirepoix. First up, the carrots, which would bring sweetness and some color. Celery, which would bring some earthy and herbal notes. And onions, once again, bring sweetness, depth, and caramelization from the sugar content. Now, back into the oven, another 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, we have these beauties. Carefully transfer them to the largest pot you have. I mean, at this point, everything smells incredible. Of course, whatever burn bits, whatever fond we have, with the glass, with some water. I mean, the recipe literally has fond in its name. Now, to the pot, we add some tomatoes. And this is not just for the sweetness and the acidity. Even the umami was not yet fully discovered in 1905. The fact that Escoffier used it is genius because tomatoes are so high in glutamic acid, which is nature's G in MSG, adding a lot of savory depth to the stock. By the way, the only reason why we're using cherry tomatoes is because we're in winter right now. If it were in season, we would have stuck with regular tomato. Now, we add the bouquet garni. Sounds intimidating in French, but if you translate it back to English, it literally just meant garnished bouquet. Suddenly, not so scary, huh? We have the herby celery, which we've already added to act as the backbone. We add some celery stems for the subtle grassy, almost peppery notes. Some thyme, some earthy, slightly lemony floral notes. Some bay leaves for some mild aromatic bitterness and almost a hint of eucalyptus. For people who would like to bash bay leaf for adding nothing, a very simple way to know what it tastes like is to simmer this for half an hour. Then you have isolated bay leaf taste. All we need to do is to tie this together. I mean, to be honest, we're going to pass it through a sieve anyway, but in the spirit of Escoffier, we tie this together. A few cloves of garlic, again, for depth and the sweet notes. And reinforcing the sweet notes, we add some cloves, also for a bit of warm spice. And in the spirit of Escoffier, even though it makes absolutely no difference, we're going to put them in the onions. Close enough, just add the rest, sieve them out. Now we cover this with all the water you can find. If this were my recipe, of course, everything would go into a pressure cooker. But since the commercial pressure cooker was not invented until 1938, in the spirit of Escoffier, let's take this journey together. 10 hours, low heat, mothering, skimming along the way. And tomorrow, Beef Bourguignon. Our stock is ready and cooling down in the fridge. Now we're ready to talk about the meat. The cut of meat we're using is the paleron, which is mentioned on the same page of Escoffier's cookbook. It is the shoulder clod, which is marbled with connective tissue. In modern-day butchery, the paleron is usually further divided. In the English-speaking world, the closest thing would be the feather blade. And today, for the purpose of demonstration, we've chosen the flat iron end of the feather blade, which, if further divided, would become the flat iron steak. Now, the first thing we need to do is to lard the meat, which, upon initial reading, I thought meant simply laying layers of lardons on the meat. But of course, it's more complicated than that. What Escoffier suggested was an old-school French method of tenderizing, moistening meat using a larding needle, which flew in from Paris yesterday. And through the needle, we are simply going to go across the grains and inserting pieces of bacon fat. And during cooking, the bacon would render out its fat, keeping the meat moist. Very simple. Today, to go the extra mile, only use the very fatty part of the bacon. This is a technique no longer used even in French fine dining, from my understanding, talking to a few chefs, because modern day breeding makes for much fattier animals than they used to 100 years ago. So the fat marbling and the cooking down of the connective tissue alone is sufficient to keep most braising joints extremely moist after a long period of cooking. Now, let the fun begin. We're simply going to clip bacon, one end, there we go, across the grain. Trim off the excess later. I must say it's not easy. I suppose that's one reason why people stop doing it. Not easy at all. Perfect. Trim off excess. It's okay to leave a tiny bit because they'll shrink during cooking. Now, we transfer a well-larded piece of feather blade to a tray. And no, we don't get to start cooking yet. We marinate this beautiful piece of meat with some cognac, which I assume was much cheaper 100 years ago. And there are a couple of reasons. First, the alcohol would help to break down the protein, giving us very subtle tenderization of the meat. And more importantly, it imparts a rich, fruity, and aromatic flavors to the meat. And I suspect this step in Escoffier's cookbook is what inspired many modern recipes, calling for a red wine marination before cooking. We simply leave this in the fridge for 2 to 3 hours while we deal with the sauce. So, to make the famous Sauce Espagnole, the Spanish sauce, we first make a dark roux. Equal parts butter and flour. And the workout begins. The objective of the exercise here is very simple. We want the fat to coat the flour, and in turn coating each start granule of the flour, preventing them from clumping together when we introduce the liquid. And in the process, we start cooking the flour, developing deep flavors, the toasty notes, similar to the crust of a really tasty piece of bread. And the Spanish sauce is one of the great mother sauces in French cooking. The base for demi-glace or Bordelais sauce, just to name a couple. And what sets it apart from other French mother sauces is the introduction of tomato, which likely came from the Americas via Spain, which could partly explain the naming of the sauce. And of course, we all know tomato puree is extremely umami packed. Once we're getting dark blonde, we're entering the Maillard reaction, the caramelization territory, really building depth of flavor. And it goes from blonde to brown to black extremely fast. Now, we need to start mothering it, lowering the heat slightly to buy us more time. Once we have this light brown color, we start to slowly incorporate our brown stock directly from the fridge, bit by bit, like you would any roux. And as you introduce the liquid, the starch from the roux starts to swell, gelatinizing and thickening in the process. And that's why it's of extreme importance that the stock has to come from the fridge, as the cold temperature would slow down the swelling, buying you more time to whisk to prevent them from clumping together, giving you this smooth, beautiful texture you would associate with a roux. Bit by bit. And in this genius recipe, the smooth texture is not just from the flour itself, but from the extremely high, what is now gelatin content, from the brown stock we spent 10 hours simmering. Now the rest of the stock. Now to the liquid, we incorporate the tomato puree we talked about earlier. And it's interesting to me that in older French cookbooks, tomato puree and wine are often not cooked down, just added directly to the liquid. And I assume it makes sense because most of these stews are cooked in the oven for a long period, giving time for the harshness of the tomato puree and the acidity, alcohol, and harshness from the wine to slowly evaporate, imparting more flavors in the process than you would a fast reduction. And to that, we once again add the mirepoix, a very small amount compared to the size of the liquid. Given we've already introduced those flavors in the brown stock, I assume this is more to add some freshness and to reinforce those flavors rather than adding a lot of flavors. So they go in. And on the theme of reinforcing flavors, once again, the bouquet garni. And we simply cover and simmer this for 2 to 3 hours. So this will be ready around the same time as our cognac marinated beef. I'll see you then. After 3 hours in the fridge and drying the surface vigorously, we have this marbled beauty. As you can see, the alcohol has slightly denatured the surface, and it certainly has drawn out quite a bit of what I suspect to be myoglobin from the beef. Now, we're ready to cook. While I'm a huge advocate of browning, Maillard reaction, given the recipe calls for butter, and this thing is full of cognac, let's start slow and see where we go from there. I know I should use a bigger pot, but I also don't want to unnecessarily dilute everything. So let's see how this one goes. Perfect. The cognac really brings a lot of the oaky caramel notes to the dish. So it's not merely there for window dressing. And these caramel notes works extremely well with the butter. Given we haven't caused the fire, you can bring in some more heat. I'm mindful to not take this above 150 until everything's brown, bearing in mind the smoke point of the milk solubles of the butter. Already not sticking, so that's a good sign. And since the recipe never called for salt, I'm going to take the executive decision of salting it right now. I want to say this cognac marination is one of my favorite discoveries in this journey. And I suspect I'll be using that a lot more with much cheaper cognac, of course. Oh, look at this beautiful browning. Oh, look at that. Oh yeah, perfect. Now, once all sides are golden brown, we start to introduce the liquid in the order prescribed by Mr. Escoffier. First up, the red wine. And like many old school French recipes, they never call for the cooking out of the alcohol of the red wine. So we'll follow that. To that we add some veal stock, which is cooked using just veal bones, but with an identical method to the brown stock we made. And this, once again, will bring a lot of body to the cooking liquid. And to that, we add our Spanish sauce. 2 deciliters for every liter of liquid in total. So 2 days of work, 20% of your cooking liquid. Welcome to classic French cooking. Perfect. Now, we add, I've lost count, but probably round 3 of the bouquet garni. And the trimmings, or the stems, from the mushrooms we'll be using later for the garnish. And these will add a lot of subtle umami to the dish. Now, modern recipes often call for parchment paper made cartouche before this goes into the oven. But doing a bit of research, I found out that the lid was the more common practice because ovens back in the days do not always heat evenly, and the lid would ensure even temperature throughout the pot. So, back to a simmer, lid on, and this goes into a 150 oven initially for 2 hours. Now, we prepare the garniture bourguignon, the bourguignon garnish, starting with the pearl onions, glazed in butter and sugar until tender and slightly caramelized. Next up, the mushrooms, sautéed in butter until golden brown. Next up, we blanch some lardons to remove the excess salt, then sauté them until crispy. Perfect, and that's our bourguignon garnish ready. After 2 hours in the oven, we have this beauty. Beautifully browned, all the connective tissue has softened into extremely tasty gelatine. And now, as prescribed by Mr. Escoffier, we transfer this to a new casserole dish. Oh, look at that, incredible. We add the garnish. Now we add this beautiful sauce we spent 2 days working on it. Incredible. Wow, this is incredible, I have to say. Lid back on, and this beauty goes back to the oven for the last 1/3 of cooking for another hour. After another hour in the oven, we have this beauty. There's not much reduction going on as we're relying on the power of the roux, but the flavors, you can smell the mushrooms and the bacon, and the sauce has a completely different profile than bourguignons you would associate it with. You can really still feel the fruitiness, the sharpness, and a bit of the acidity from the red wine, which is exactly what à la bourguignon was going for. And of course, the star of the show, the piece of beef, is simply fork tender. Look at the gelatine on top. The lardons we inserted have fully melted. You can't even see them anymore. But the juiciness and the flavors have been imparted, keeping this wonderful piece of meat moist. The texture, the balance is incredible. If this is what 1903 tasted like, it must have been a wonderful time to live. This is Escoffier's piece of beef à la bourguignon. So good. Wow.